Well, the time has finally come. Disney's live-action Snow White remake has finally been released after about 2 years of delays, and I managed to get myself a seat to the very first viewing of the movie at 10 AM in order to get my review done on the same day. And seeing as this movie is obviously very divisive on the internet, I wanted to make this review as much about the movie as possible, and not about opinions or biases, but about the objective qualities that make a film bad or good. And so without further ado, let's just get into it. Probably the most important part of this review will be the plot summary, because this was really where the controversy first started, as of course Rachel Zegler, who played Snow White, openly talked about the ways that they changed the story from the original.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that is
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be.
As well as some viral on-set photos of the 7 bandits instead of the 7 dwarves. So was the movie really a completely different story to the original? Well, yes and no. And that's really at the crux of why this movie fails to deliver. Because the movie starts pretty much following the same story as the original Snow White, with some minor additions to help flesh out the world and the backstory, but all in all, it remains the same. And I was thinking to myself, hang on, this is definitely not the movie that the cast said they made, as this one is so similar to the original. However, that only lasts up until a point, because Snow White's life gets threatened by the evil queen, and she runs into the forest much like the first one, and she meets the dwarves much like the first one. However, she ends up leaving the dwarves to go back into the forest, which is where we start to see the changes that were made, because she comes across the 7 bandits in the forest, and we can quite easily see that this was probably what the initial idea for this movie was. But after backlash, they added the dwarves back into the story, and it was at this moment that the movie really took a turn for the worst, because the whole 7 bandit storyline just really didn't seem to fit with the rest of the movie, and only 2 bandits do the talking, with one being Jonathan, who replaces the prince in this movie, as he is now not a prince, but more so a leader of the bandits. And then we also see some other guy with a crossbow also have some lines of dialogue. But the other 5 bandits hardly say a word, and we don't really understand the point of the bandit storyline at all. And to make it even worse, the bandit with a crossbow says a line about another bandit and mentions her name. And it makes you think to yourself, who the heck are you even talking about? I haven't heard any other bandits speak yet. And that line really makes it obvious that there were a lot of scenes with the bandits that were cut, and obviously they were meant to be the major storyline in the film, but they changed it back to the dwarves in reshoots to try and save the film with the fans. Because the way that that bandit with a crossbow talks about the other character, it's very obvious that we are meant to know who they are, and it's very obvious that we were probably meant to have been sitting with these bandits for about 20 minutes up until this point, and not the 2 minutes that we see them in the forest. And so the overall bandit subplot creates some really bad pacing issues, where the story struggles to flow and so many scenes just feel like fluff, that have absolutely no point and lead nowhere, but is really just filling in time between the basic story beats that they need to hit in order to match the original and try and please the fans. Because Snow White then returns to the dwarves with the bandits, and then the bandits leave again in yet another pointless scene, in which we then see the queen turn into the old lady and give Snow White the apple, and much like the original, she dies and is then brought back to life with true love's kiss by Jonathan. And after she's revived, she then marches into the castle and dethrones the queen by telling all her henchmen and the city's civilians that she is kind and the queen is evil, in which they all just turn on the queen and she is then conquered, in what definitely feels like a cheap and rushed anticlimax that doesn't really leave you satisfied in any way, because why couldn't she have just done this in the very beginning of the film? I mean, the movie would argue that she didn't believe in herself in the beginning, and so she couldn't stand up to the queen because she didn't have that self-confidence. However, if the entire character arc and story arc is that she just fluffs about for 80 minutes and then randomly starts to believe in herself, it's really quite a lackluster story. Because while you could argue that the original Snow White didn't have much of a personal character arc as well, the original movie movie didn't have the bandit subplot mucking up the pacing and ruining any tension that could be built with the Queen trying to kill Snow White. And so in the first movie, you really have a lot of tension built up in anticipating if the Queen will be able to kill her, and so while she's hiding with the dwarves and then we see the Queen get to her with the apple, you really feel that emotion. Whereas because this film was constantly going between a bunch of subplots, it was really hard to find any grounding in the story, and it was hard to sit in moments long enough for the emotion to hit us. And so that's really the plot of the movie, but now let's get to the positives and the negatives, starting with the positives, because while yes, this movie isn't great, I have to be honest and say that there were a few moments I kinda enjoyed, with one being a nice heartwarming scene with Dopey, because even though he and the rest of the dwarves looked absolutely terrible in a live-action film and were very uncanny valley, some of his emotional moments did kind of land, and we also saw some good moments with Grumpy as his character arc developed in a way that I kind of enjoyed. And it's also gotta be said that Rachel Zegler can absolutely sing, because regardless what your opinion on her comments are, or what you think of this movie, she can really deliver when it comes to singing, and as far as her performance as Snow White goes, it was actually quite good, as her musical theatre background and training most definitely shows in her performance in the film. But that's it for the positives, and now let's get to the negatives. For starters, we of course have to mention the look of the dwarves, because it is just so jarring seeing this in a live-action movie. They just stick out like a sore thumb, and while the portrayals of them were good, the overall look is just horrific and takes away from any of the good moments that they could have had. And then we also have some problems with the cinematography, because while it does look very vibrant and clearly very high quality, it didn't seem to match the story that it was telling. Because I think sometimes things can look too clean and too crisp to the point where it makes the characters, especially in live action, look like a bunch of people just playing dress up in a park. It looked as though it was a cosplay of Snow White and not the real deal. Because I think some slightly different lighting, color grading, and a little bit of grain wouldn't have hurt the movie at all, because vibrance can definitely work better in animation, but when it comes to live action, the world needs to look both fantastical and lived in, whereas this film in Snow White doesn't look lived in at all. And so all in all, this isn't a Madam Web level bad film, but it definitely isn't anything I think anyone will remember or rewatch, as even children who this movie was clearly intended for will probably just forget about this movie and move on, and probably not go back to rewatching it, as they've got things like Moana and Frozen to rewatch, which are genuinely fun, good films, as opposed to this one, which at the end of the day was just over-corporatized meh, and it's probably the worst movie I've seen all year. But we are only a few months in, so we'll see what happens in the future, and we'll see if there's another movie that might come along to dethrone it. But all in all, that's my review of Snow White, and let me know your thoughts on the film down below in the comments, and if you liked the video, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and until next time, take care.